Welcome back to Following Jesus, Matthew. It is good to have you with us internationally as we continue this presentation from the Broken Bay Institute in Sydney, Australia, of course partly supported by the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference. I mentioned at the beginning that we are represented in almost a dozen countries, possibly more depending on how you're going with registrations. We would certainly like you to register, also to keep the questions coming and to take the survey on your screens as well. But we are certainly represented around Australia, also in New Zealand, in Italy, in Fiji, also France, Hong Kong, Palestine, the Philippines, Scotland and the United States. Welcome to you all. We continue the presentation now by going back to the first of the speakers that we introduced today. That's Father Chris Monaghan. Father Chris is a Passionist priest, and he is here today now to talk to us about the second of his subjects, and that is holding it together, the challenges of being church. Father Chris.
Thank you, Mike. Well, we had some questions during the break, and some of them we'll be addressing later on this afternoon at the panel time. But Anita from St Michael's and John's Parish in Horsham has asked an interesting question to start up. Where was the author of Matthew's Gospel living? Well, the short answer is we don't know. But reading the Gospel by using some form of mirror reading, we've got at least some example or some hints as to what kind of community Matthew's community was, and indeed Matthew himself or herself. You've got where was the community of Matthew's Gospel, and where was Matthew himself? So there are questions. What I would say is that, yes, we don't know, but the Gospel of Matthew is a very cosmopolitan gospel. It's written for a community that's urban, and so that already gives us some lead as to where it might be. We know that it's mixed, Jews and Gentiles. It's interesting to know that it's a community that has some degree of wealth, because that text where Jesus sends out the disciples in chapter 10, it's not just take copper with you, or copper and silver as in Luke, but Matthew has take no copper, silver or gold. So you don't bother to do that unless you're talking about a community that in fact has some wealth. So we've got that kind of indication about the community. So where were they? Thinking tends to actually often coincide between the location for Matthew and the location for Luke. So a likely place is either, we know that Antioch in Syria was certainly one location that's been favoured, but also moving into modern Turkey or Asia Minor. There's another Antioch there as well, but mixed communities. So that's about as much as an answer I can give to that question, and some of the other questions will come to after Dorothy's presentation later on. So just to go back over what we've been doing so far. In our first session, we paid attention to some of the important elements of the context of Matthew, a gospel written for a diverse community of believers in an unsettling and perhaps for some, exciting time of transition and change. We have seen some of the ways in which Matthew sets out to hold it all together in a creative tension by means of a particular view of God's saving history, in which their Jewish past was honoured, and yet they were invited to have a sense of openness and confidence in what they were already experiencing as Gentiles came into the community. This was all to be seen as part of God's saving plan. Not only that, they were encouraged to face the future with trust because of Jesus' promise to be with them to the end of the age. So we've already dealt with those elements there. And as Dorothy would have pointed out, one of the distinctive characteristics of Matthew's Gospel was how the many traditions of Jesus have been brought together. The end result is a gospel that is very distinctive because of its 5 discourses, and we've actually seen not only Dorothy point this out, but Father Nicholas in his own talk. So the reader familiar with Matthew will know that it is not as though Jesus doesn't speak in the other sections of the gospel. No, it is more the traditions of Jesus have been brought together in these discourses so that various topics can be treated in a systematic and a sustained fashion. Matthew, the teacher. The aim of the discourses is to better instruct the community onto how to see and respond to Jesus as disciples, in a word, how to follow him. So Dorothy has already explored with you some of the richness of the first of the discourses, namely the Sermon on the Mount, with its call to a new righteousness, a way of being in right relationship, and the challenge to be salt for the earth and light for the world. So far, some of the questions that have come to us have been with regard to this, how to be righteous, and Dorothy will be returning to that when we come to the panel stage of our presentations. So what I'd like to do with you now is to take some soundings from the discourses that punctuate Matthew's Gospel. And I thank Father Nicholas for making sure that we haven't all stolen each other's thunder here. But I will take some soundings into some of the more particular elements of Matthew's Gospel, elements that you would otherwise not be particularly aware of. It's like unravelling that ball of string that is the Gospels. All the colours get merged together. So we're trying to unravel that to try and bring out the treasure that is Matthew's Gospel for us, bring it into better relief. So I'll be taking texts from the Commission of the Disciples in chapter 10, from the Parables Discourse in Matthew 13, the Community Rule in chapter 18, and the final discourse about how to prepare for the Lord's return in Matthew 25. So Matthew presents Jesus forming the disciples in a number of ways. They are prepared and schooled in the values of the kingdom in the Sermon on the Mount, where they're called, as Dorothy reminded us, to build their houses on rock. But after this, where Jesus' power and authority as a teacher has been recognised, Matthew then forms a whole set of miracle stories together in chapters 8 to 9. He does this to highlight Jesus' power not only in word, but in deed. And it's in this context that the disciples are going to, we notice that the word for following, for discipleship, starts to come up again and again in the narrative. But in this section there's a lot of controversies. And by these controversy stories, I mean that other people aren't so pleased with what Jesus is doing or saying. They oppose him, they question him, they challenge him, and not only him, the disciples. The narrative unfolds at a frenetic pace, and we're wondering how Jesus himself, let alone the disciples, will be able to deal with it. So the disciples accompany Jesus in these chapters, and they witness the inbreaking of the kingdom, as Jesus reaches into the suffering of people in the countryside, in the cities, and revealing that his power is that of the suffering servant, the one who carries our infirmities. This is a very particular part of Matthew's portrait of Jesus. A very vulnerable Jesus, a Jesus who reaches into our sufferings, into our lives, the one who knows who we are, what we need to hear. So not everyone who witnesses Jesus' ministry approves of it, and objections begin to be raised. And while Jesus sweeps all the opposition before him, the disciples are reminded that their faith and understanding is not yet what it needs to be. Father Nicholas has already indicated that Matthew softens off Mark's portrait, that's true, but not so much that they get away scot-free. This is brought home when they are caught with Jesus in the storm on the lake and cry out to Jesus for help in the midst of their terror. I find it most encouraging to see that these well-intentioned disciples, those fearful disciples, who are going to be precisely the ones that Jesus will commission to carry his message to the lost sheep of the house of Israel in chapter 10. Yes, they are people of little faith, but even people of little faith have their role to play when the harvest is plentiful and the labourers are few. So the second major discourse is that of chapter 10, known as the Commission of the Disciples or the Missionary Discourse. By the time that Matthew's Gospel is written, the followers of Jesus have had some decades of experience, and this is something we need to remember. 50 years of Christian experience of preaching the message of Jesus. So mention has already been made that the saying source that Matthew and Luke share has probably been shaped by radical itinerant preachers, and they brought an edge to the message that they preached. These are the ones who had learned to travel light, without gold or silver or bronze. They know what it's like to walk away from a town shaking the dust from their feet, in the face of rejection and misunderstanding. They had learned the truth of Jesus' words that we find only in Matthew. I send you out as sheep among wolves, so be as gentle as doves, but as cunning as serpents. A lesson for the church in every age, I would say. So one of the fascinating things that Matthew does in this chapter is include sayings about rejection, arrests and persecution that Mark in Mark's Gospel had earlier seen as being signs of the end time. But they are now part and parcel of the life of the church. Uncertain and fearful they may be, but now is the time to stand up and be counted. In the midst of it all, the community are reminded that those who lose their lives will find it, and that even a cup of water given out of charity will be rewarded. Such kindness will not be forgotten when the judgment comes. As we move to the parabolic discourse in chapter 13, we notice that the disciples have been commissioned and instructed, and they continue to accompany Jesus as the opposition strengthens and the danger for both Jesus and his disciples increases. It seems that for many the person of Jesus and his ministry have become a confronting conundrum and an unsolvable riddle. It is in this context that we come to the third of Matthew's discourses, known as the parabolic discourse. In Mark's Gospel, it's interesting to note that Jesus speaks so that people will not understand. But it's in Matthew, Jesus teaches in parables because they don't understand. It's quite a big difference. It's in response to the fact that people do not understand Jesus. Jesus is in fact a living parable. To put it another way, he may as well speak in riddles because his life is already a riddle, the greatest of all the living parables. In the parabolic discourse, Matthew's unique and precious contribution can be clearly seen. It's only here that we find the parable of the weeds and the wheat, the parables of the treasure hidden in the field, the pearl of great price, and the dragnet that drags us all in, good and bad. The wisdom that Jesus calls us to in Matthew is that of choosing the pearl of great price when we see it. It is the wisdom to recognize the treasure hidden in a field and be prepared to risk everything to have it. The Christian disciple must live in the complexities of the world, but it's precisely in the midst of it all that the treasures are hidden, and that's true of disciples of every age. The question, of course, has always been, do we have the eyes to see them and the faith and the courage to hold them? The parable of the weeds and wheat in Matthew chapter 13 is a subtle and instructive parable about the nature of community and the challenges it faces in every age. The tares in the wheat, the weeds in the wheat are unique to Matthew. Weeds and wheat grow side by side. So what is to be done? The Matthean community are called to come to terms with the fact that good and evil are found in the world, in the Christian community, and in each of us. 2,000 years later, we'd have to say, nothing has changed. In the midst of it all, we are called not to lose hope in God's promises and power to bring all things in their time to fulfillment and harvest. In the face of opposition and rejection as they waited for Jesus' return, perhaps some community members had lost hope and even the capacity to love. Because of lawlessness, the love of many will grow cold. You've got that in Matthew chapter 24, verse 12, only in Matthew. In this gospel, concerned with being in right relationship, what happens in a community, what happens in a parish, what happens in a church, or in the world when love grows cold. Matthew's advice is that hope is too precious to lose or to be thrown away lightly. As the gospel proceeds, we move along to chapter 18, known as the community rule. So the commission of the disciples earlier in chapter 10 gave firm indications of what the Matthean community had learned about courage in the face of opposition over 50 years. So in a similar way, what's called the community rule in Matthew 18 provides a glimpse of what they had learned about being disciples and, as Dorothy pointed out, as being leaders in a community, and some of the ongoing challenges that confronted them. The chapter begins with the disciples arguing about who is the greatest. And Jesus' response is very clear. It is humility that will be the sign of leadership in the community of disciples. One of the unique stories in Matthew, and this is just a little aside, but I can't help but give it, at the end of chapter 17, Jesus instructs Peter to throw out a line about to pay the temple tax. I mean, it's one of those stories, and then throws out a line, gets the fish, it comes in, he gets a shekel. So one half of the shekel is going to go for Jesus, and who for the other half? Oh, well, Peter in Matthew's Gospel. And that provides the segue, if you like, into the whole question about them arguing about who is the greatest. So humility will be the sign of leadership. So in what follows, leaders are commanded not to lead others in the community to sin. Neither are they to look down on those who have lost their way. Matthew alone confronts us with the unsettling truth that it is the angels of those we despise who are closest to God, a challenge in every age. Matthew's community are instructed in no uncertain terms in Matthew 18 that God's will is clear. Not one of the little ones should perish. And as the discourse unfolds, we're led to see that by little ones, Matthew means those who lose their way, the sinners in the community. So the parable of the lost sheep now becomes a parable about community members, as Matthew would describe it, who have gone astray. It would seem that there's a struggle going on in the community as to how to best respond to known sinners. Should we exclude them, or should we forgive them? And if we forgive them, how often? Matthew 18, 15 to 20, it's a text that we've asked you for to deal with in question time, in the discussion time that follows this, reveals that they had a reasonable and fair process in place as to how to deal with sinners. And we've dealt with this recently, this last Sunday. First of all, you talk about matters individually, and if that doesn't work, then take others along with you. If that doesn't work, then the whole community needs to try and bring them back. If that doesn't bring them home, such a person is to be treated as a tax collector and a Gentile. So the question placed squarely before the Matthean community is when to use such a process. They are warned that what they bind on earth is bound in heaven, and that Jesus is in our midst when two or three are gathered in his name. It's fascinating to see how Matthew addresses the different tendencies in the community, holding them together and making sure that one saying of Jesus needs to be seen in the light of other sayings and teachings. In this case, they have a structure of church discipline, but it must be tempered by forgiveness. The question of how many times we should forgive a brother or sister is critical. Jesus' response is that forgiving 7 times is a good start, but what is needed is the ability to forgive 70 times 7. If that doesn't drive the message home, Matthew continues with another parable well known to us all, that of the unforgiving servant. Forgiven an astronomical sum, the unforgiving servant has not yet learnt that what we have received should then be extended to others. Once again, we're reminded that it is not good enough to see the speck in the eye of another when we have a log in our own, and that the forgiveness we have received must always be extended. That's how we remain and build a community of right relationship. The church in every age wrestles at some level with the boundless generosity of God. Who has not had their questions when known sinners have had a last-minute conversion and made a deathbed confession? Surely it can't be that easy, we find ourselves asking. It just doesn't seem right. There must be some reward for a faithful life of following Jesus as a disciple. It would seem that Matthew's mixed community of Jews and Gentiles are faced with the same challenge. Jesus' parable of the workers in the vineyard in chapter 20 is used to address this complex and emotive issue. Can everyone get the same wage when some have worked hard and faithfully in the heat of the day and others have worked just a single hour? Is the owner of the vineyard so foolish and crazy that they would pay everyone the same wage? Why pay those who came last first, and do so in the sight of others? Surely the problem could have been avoided if those who had worked all day had been paid first. They would have gone off in peace and been none the wiser. But that, of course, is the point of the parable. Jesus pushes us to enter into a bigger world where God's logic and God's ways strip away what is self-centered and lacking in generosity within us. God's kingdom is not like the kingdoms that we construct. Indeed, why should it concern us if God is generous? Shouldn't our question rather be, why are we not able to be the same? So as we come to dealing with the last of the discourses in chapter 25, it's worth reminding ourselves of what it must have been like for a community some 50 years on, after the death of Jesus, after the death of Peter and Paul. Decades had passed and Jesus had not yet returned. They had been faithful in the midst of misunderstanding and opposition, and they'd experienced the hope and enthusiasm that went with the growth of the community in its early days. We've already seen how persecution and opposition have been understood as signs of Jesus' signs of Jesus' impending return in Mark, and now signs of part of the life of the church in every age. So in the last of Jesus' discourses in chapter 24 and 25, Matthew offers a vision of how disciples in every age are called to follow Jesus by faithful persistence, by not losing heart, by not falling into the danger of complacency, and most important of all, by seeing and responding to Jesus who comes to meet us in hidden ways in our brothers and sisters who are most in need. So Matthew's community was in danger of losing its edge. Complacency was creeping in. If Jesus was not going to return soon, why try so hard? Why put yourself at risk? Why not take an easier path? So we can find ourselves asking the same question even more after 2,000 years. So Jesus' parable of the wise and foolish bridesmaids is used to make a point. When the bridegroom takes so long to return, it's not surprising that disciples in any age can fall asleep. But the wise ones will have their supply of oil ready, so that when the call comes, they can trim their lamps and enter into the banquet. So it's natural that we should ask, what is the oil that is needed? And once again, Matthew uses one last parable, only found in Matthew. It's interesting to see that this gospel that is so interested and so concerned to teach us about the higher righteousness should conclude with Jesus giving us a scene of the last judgment. Some will inherit the kingdom and some will not. When it's all said and done, discipleship calls us to many things. But Matthew's community and the church in every age is reminded that we are going to be judged on the quality of our care for the hungry, for the thirsty, for the stranger, the naked and the sick, and those who are imprisoned. If we care for them, we will indeed be disciples, and we will have learned to follow Jesus. Thank you.
Thanks indeed to Father Chris Monaghan CP, who will be joining us shortly for a discussion on some of your questions. He began, of course, his talk there in this part of the program by answering one of them. Please let us know those questions as you continue to register, and also, of course, make sure you answer the survey that is on screen as well. We are about to take a break before we will move into our final presentation before going into those questions, and that will come from the Reverend Dorothy Lee. It is good to have you wherever you are watching this presentation. So far, I've tracked some 11 centres in New Zealand, including the Maori Hospital, or rather the Mercy Hospital at Maori Hill in Auckland. Welcome to you, and welcome to all who are with this presentation following Jesus, Matthew.